Welcome back to Taiwan versus the world. Today we will dive into political warfare. This is a favorite topic on our program as we look at what Taiwan can do to protect itself against non-military attacks. And we have two excellent sources on the topic today. Then we will circle back to actual military operations and hear from another expert about what the situation in Iran really teaches us about Taiwan's defense. And now, let's start with today's interview. We often emphasize the concept that the biggest danger for Taiwan from China is not necessarily military. It can also be non-military. It can be information war, it can be influence war, it can be political warfare. So we are going to discuss this topic today with two people, Maria Thornton and Tony Hu. Maria and Tony, hello and welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Hello.
I would kindly ask both of you to introduce yourself. Maybe Maria, you want to introduce yourself first?
Hi, my name is Mariah Thornton. I am currently a teaching fellow at the International Relations Department at the London School of Economics. My PhD research looked at Taiwan's political warfare system, or the political warfare system in Taiwan, is what I should say. And I'll also just briefly say that I worked at the Taipei Representative Office for 2.5 years from 2018 to 2020, which is in part what motivated me to be interested in this particular topic.
Wonderful. My name is Tony Hu. I'm a retired United States Air Force officer and also a Department of Defense civilian. So right now I am fully retired, but I enjoy continue to monitor what's happening between Taiwan and China.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And to enter the topic, let's start with the basics. What is political warfare? I would like the audience to have a clear idea of what it is, what it includes, what it does not include, and how it differs with other form of non-lethal action. And Maria, since you wrote on the topic, maybe you want to start with defining political warfare for us.
So, political warfare is difficult to define, but how it has been defined is that it's basically everything short of all-out physical warfare. So it includes different elements within it. It includes psychological warfare. It includes like taking care of fellow troops. So it's a lot of other things besides just all-out warfare, and a lot of it I can distill down to really two dimensions. One is for whom do we fight, or 为谁而战 is the term in Mandarin, and for what do we fight, 为何而战. And these things are really geared towards instilling people's morale, keeping up morale in a wartime scenario, and preparing civil society for any kind of both interference, but also if war does happen. And the way that political warfare has been described, by Zhang Jingguo and Chiang Kai-shek as it was originally conceived, is basically mostly about the morale and willingness to fight. And I would say political warfare historically has also been focused on cultivating political loyalty to what used to be the KMT, but is now, the Republic of China, because due to democratization, Taiwan's left its martial law era. But it was originally about cultivating political loyalty to the KMT, and that was both among civilians as well as the army. So that is what political warfare, broadly speaking, is about. And I think in my research, it really connects to whole of society resistance in Taiwan.
Tony, you may want also to give your own definition as a military person. How would you define political warfare?
Basically, political warfare is anything short of actual shooting. And the purpose of political warfare is very basic, winning the hearts and minds of the people to achieve your political objective. And that's it. You use all different means, obviously. You know, uh, there are some overactions and that you can do to win the hearts and minds of people. But basically, that's the bottom line: how to win the people, and so that you can achieve your political objective.
Great, thank you very much. And then now, the next natural question is to ask what is actually uh, Taiwan doing about it? Because it's not necessarily something we see. It seems like sometimes this is kind of invisible, perhaps by design, and sometimes it is also criticized. We often hear that maybe Taiwan is not understanding this enough because conversely, we hear about China doing an enormous amount of political warfare, at least the
Oh, yeah.
way you defined it. So maybe you can tell us what is Taiwan doing right now about political warfare? Maybe, Tony, you want to start?
Sure. I think Taiwan is trying to bring awareness of China's disinformation campaign, cyber attack,
Mm.
and so that help people identify false information or information that deliberately trying to uh, radicalize people and try to break Taiwan apart from the inside. In addition, Taiwan is trying to reduce economic dependency uh, on China so that China couldn't use the economic side to like, hey, I'm not buying your pineapples and try to use the pineapple farmers to uprise against the government or the fish farmers. So export to China has reduced from 40% of exports to 2016 down to 24% last year. So that's what Taiwan is trying to do is take that weapon away, the economic weapon away from China. So I think that's one of the political warfare that they're doing. Another thing is uh, just like Voice of America conduct political warfare against China, United States use that as a tool, and Taiwan certainly has its own tool through Radio Taiwan International broadcasts into China to bring truth and information other than Xinhua released information to the people of China. I think these are all political warfare that Taiwan is doing.
Thank you, Maria. Do you want to tell us what you see Taiwan doing?
Yes, of course. So I'll just touch on your point about criticism of political warfare in Taiwan because that was something that came up in my own research and field work. And the reason why it's contentious is because, as we can all imagine, uh, political warfare has its legacy in Taiwan's martial law era, under which the KMT governed arguably in a quite invasive way, based on the experience of certain sectors of Taiwanese society. And so political warfare has a contentious history for this reason, because in the past it was used as a way of monitoring correspondence. And looking for any kinds of what's termed defects, which basically means any kind of evidence that either military or civilians might have pro-Chinese Communist Party sympathies may defect to the CCP, or may share intelligence with the CCP. So political warfare was used as a tool to look for kind of these defects in thinking, if you want to call it that, which maybe rendered the military more and state more vulnerable to CCP interference. So we have to acknowledge that it was used as a tool of political control at some point during Taiwan's martial law era. And it's also important to mention the reason why it has a contentious history and a mixed legacy in Taiwan today is that it was also used as a tool to root out Taiwanese independence movement. And this was particularly the case when Wang Hui was basically head of political warfare throughout the 1970s. and 80s because and the reason why political warfare was used as a way of rooting out Taiwanese independence movement and this kind of thinking was because it was seen as a threat to the unity of the Republic of China state, and it was seen as Taiwanese independence was seen by political warfare elites as a form of factionalism, and this factionalism made it dangerous or vulnerable to CCP interference. And so this was something that political warfare elites wanted to avoid. However, that being said, I want to say that political warfare, though it has this mixed legacy, this controversial legacy, in that plays out in Taiwan today, political warfare also plays, like Tony was suggesting, political warfare actually plays a pretty important role in Taiwan's modern counterinterference. And so I would just to add on to what Tony was saying, uh, political warfare is important for educating Taiwanese civilians and the military about the nature of Chinese interference in the form of United Front work, educating the civilians and military about what is the ideology that informs United Front work, how United Front work manifests. Um, and also, political warfare is trying to kind of evoke a nationalist sentiment among people, to not succumb maybe to some of the temptations or tricks of United Front work, if you want to call it those things. And so that's a lot of what political warfare is focused on doing. And I'll just mention that one of the important facets of political warfare that remains important to Taiwan's counter-interference strategy today is all-out defense education, 全民国防教育. And
Mhm.
all-out defense education is important because it's doing many things. It's helping to educate the public about how to deal with uncertainty. So this is not just the uncertainty of whether war, China will launch a war or an invasion or military aggression towards Taiwan. It's also like the uncertainty that's brought about by environmental disasters and how civilians can effectively, verify information in an environmental disaster situation or in a military aggression situation, um, which will make them less likely to be susceptible to disinformation or manipulation from the CCP because the CCP has been shown to take advantage of these kind of vulnerable situations, whether that's military aggression or, environmental disasters like an earthquake. And so all-out defense education is a really important part of how political warfare operates today. I'll just add one more thing that another thing to note about political warfare is that it has been reformed since Taiwan democratized under a series of reforms called the nationalization of the military, um, or 军队国家化 in Chinese. And the nationalization of the military helped to make the political warfare system more compatible with the Republic of China slash Taiwan's new political system as it democratized over time. So yes, it was a martial law era institution that was used for political control in various ways, but it has been reformed and adapted since democratization, and it plays an important role in counterinterference through education today.
That's actually something that I would like to ask you to go further. Both of you, you talked about defense education. What exactly is that? And concretely, what does it look like? I remember, for example, there were leaflets about how to act in case of crisis. Is this what we are talking about? And how does that work?
Yeah, actually, this last weekend, just a couple of days ago, I was at a place that conducts civil all-out 全民国防, all-out defense, and these people actually pays about 2,000 NT themselves for 4 days of training on how to recognize disinformation, how to conduct emergency first aid, and even weapons familiarization. So uh, this is something I think more and more people realize that uh, there is a part that they can play uh, in terms of national defense, even though they're not in the military, but they can contribute to the overall country survival and the 韧性, the ability to survive in a more stringent condition, and how to identify those fifth column people. For example, what are you doing under the bridge? What are you doing near the electrical station? That type of things. So this is one of the two schools I have visited several times, and just to get a sense of Taiwan's will to fight. So in that sense, I think in general, people have been influenced successfully, because when we talk about political warfare in Taiwan, basically is Taiwan's ability to influence China, and Taiwan government's ability to influence its own people. And I think with some of the national defense handbook that came out, and the various uh, public statement by the president, I think it is catching on. So the political warfare, there are two edges, right, and two sides. One is against the enemy, and one is promoting patriotism and support for national survival within internally. So the internally portion is doing better. China is a closed society. It is a challenge for Taiwan to implement any strength in political warfare against China. But the good thing is, at least domestically, they're doing well.
And
All
this is
right.
actually another question I wanted to ask is how can we quantify how successful it is? May it be towards China or towards the Taiwanese people themselves. How can you determine the actual impact it has on people and how people are reacting to it, how much people are positively impacted by it? Perhaps, Maya, you have been studying this.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. What I would say is it's really difficult to monitor the effectiveness of, political warfare activities and educational activities. But the way that I've sought to try and understand the effectiveness of it is in part through public opinion surveys. So, National Zhengzhi University comes out with, quite well-cited public opinion surveys about Chinese and Taiwanese identity, and how Taiwanese people have been increasingly identifying as Taiwanese rather than Chinese and Taiwanese. And I would also say there have been public opinion surveys done by the Mainland Affairs Council, which show actually reasonable public support for some of the anti-espionage and anti-interference reforms that Lai Ching-te passed. So that shows that, for me, it's not a smoking gun evidence that everybody who is the recipient of this kind of all-out defense education and education around Chinese Communist Party interference, it doesn't show that everybody that's a recipient of that education feels the same way about, Chinese interference. But I think it does show that the public has an awareness and a kind of consensus that Chinese United Front work and interference and hybrid warfare, disinformation, all of these things is something that does resonate with people's experience and everyday lives enough that they would express support for some of, like I said, the anti-Chinese interference kind of reforms under Lai Ching-te. So apart from that, in terms of effectiveness, there's another a slightly troubling data point, let's say, on the effectiveness of political warfare, which is that we've also seen from the time that Tsai Ing-wen was in power since 2016 up until 2024 that there was a trebling of anti-CCP espionage cases among the Taiwanese military. So what I mean by that is more Taiwanese military personnel were had to face charges of, pro CCP espionage during this period, and that again kind of raises a question about the effectiveness of political warfare, because as we've been talking about, political warfare is on the one hand about educating people, creating an awareness, a broad societal awareness of United Front work and Chinese interference operations. But as Tony mentioned, it's also about cultivating political loyalty and nationalism and maintaining morale, so that if there is, a threat and uncertainty, whether that's military aggression or an unexpected environmental disaster, that the preparedness is there and the morale is there. And so this troubling of the espionage cases is troubling in terms of, it raises a kind of counterpoint and a question mark over the effectiveness of political warfare.
So you mentioned something interesting again for the second time. It's that it's also about keeping morale among Taiwanese people. And it is true that on the surface level, it looks like Taiwanese people are uh, being very serene about the situation. But
Mm.
as a field reporter, I always say, but what do you want people to do? They have a life to live, like they don't need on a daily basis to be stressing out about this. It doesn't change anything. So, of course, people are just going around living their life. But recently, something happened, which is that the United States suddenly declared that their intelligence community did not see China invading in 2027 after years of pushing the absurd narrative, or what we call the Davidson window, that China wanted to be ready to match them in 2027, which is something that has done a disastrous uh, that had a disastrous effect on Taiwan's political warfare by making it appear like we were doomed within just a few months. So how do we actually keep moral in Taiwan when actually nobody wants us to keep moral? Because, I mean, let's face it, it's not exactly as if the United States or other countries were actually supporting a high moral for the Taiwanese people.
I'm not sure 2027, the mention of the 2027 was such a bad idea because it did cause Taiwan to um, increase its readiness, its ability to defend and put a bit of urgency in its training and in its defense procurement. So it served a good purpose as far as urging Taiwan to move forward faster in terms of its self-defense. Now, I'm not sure if anybody can really say 2027, 2030 when, because it's totally up to one person, Xi Jinping,
Mm.
because that is the person who, in
Exactly,
his
yes.
mind, believes that the national rejuvenation of the Chinese race is his God-given duty, and for some reason, annexing Taiwan is part of that. So we have to be ready in case one day he just woke up and decided, hey, let's go, because that political warfare that China is doing on its own people, on its own military, is very successful. So when Xi Jinping says go, they will go. Unlike under democracy where people will raise the question, say, wait a minute, what are we doing? Okay. So I wouldn't totally say that 2027 wasn't a good idea. I think uh, at the time, at the time, it was a necessity for both the United States and Taiwan to get ready, at least get ready. Now, whether China does it or not, it doesn't matter, but we should be ready to continue to deter. And I think it served that purpose.
Mm.
And you see, I was nudging you a bit with this, Tony, but that I'm going to meet you in the middle here, uh, because what comes out of this little conversation we're having is that sometimes there seems to be a bit of a contradictory need. Is that on one hand, we need to create a certain sense of urgency so that Taiwan and its people support preparing defense, preparing for what happens if someday Xi Jinping decided, okay, this is the day we start a war. And at the same time, we still have to maintain moral and to reassure people that we can stand up and that we have to stand up also for non-military warfare. So what's interesting now is to ask ourselves, how do we keep a balance between these two needs?
Yeah, it's a delicate balance and uh, between the actual military preparedness and the people, the society's preparedness, and where do you place the resources in one or the other? Unfortunately, in Taiwan, where the resources is finite, so it is a competition between the two needs.
Mhm.
So, in fact, I can't even comment on what would be a good balance. But so far, the good thing is I think the people are getting more seeing the need to be prepared themselves, and that is a good thing because, as I mentioned, I was at this National Defense School this past weekend, and that school is packed for the next 4 months. They are fully every weekend. The class slot are full for the next 4 months, and I believe that's a good indication that people are picking up more of this as, hey, I need to get ready, and that is a success of so-called political warfare.
Taiwanese people take the military threat, seriously, and I think we see some indications of this. For example, with that TV program called Ground Zero, which made it onto Netflix, which envisioned how Taiwanese society and state would respond in the event of a Chinese invasion. So, that program received like mixed reception, but the fact that it's being made and it's starting this kind of conversation and this thinking, I think shows that people in Taiwan and the public do take this security issue, or this potential of a Chinese invasion quite seriously. I would also say that apart from, my research looks in part at the Taiwanese military and political warfare in the Taiwanese military, but it also looks at the civic tech community in Taiwan, a community called GovZero or 临时政府 in Chinese. And through this community, which is a civic tech community, they are taking the threat of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan very seriously in terms of the projects and technologies that they're developing, and a lot of these technologies are designed to help Taiwan's military preparedness. So, for example, one of the projects that GovZero was working on is if the Chinese ships or either PLA Navy ship or a Chinese fishing trawler cuts the internet cable, undersea water cable of Matsu, the GovZero community was developing a simulated platform that would have all of the same services as like Google, so that people would still be able to access these services even if that sea cable was cut. And I think that's a good example of how seriously this civil society group, the GovZero community, which are people who are volunteering, and there's most of them are volunteering in their spare time to lend some of their technical skills to certain projects. And so that's a good example, I think, of how seriously they take the threat, of Chinese invasion. I would also say that you might have observed that there's been a kind of effort to make data on Taiwan's air defense shelters really easy to access. So that way, if there, and again, if there was this military aggression, that people can locate the air defense shelters quite easily. And the GovZero community also helped to, create a technology that makes that data, that information that's crucial during a wartime scenario accessible to the public. So I think those things show, along with what Tony's examples, that I think those things all indicate that Tony's civil society is taking this seriously. and is being very active and dynamic in, either attending national defense education initiatives like Tony mentioned, or in, developing certain projects and technologies that's designed to help improve civic defense. There are also a number of civil defense groups that exist in Taiwan, including Kuma Academy, 义雄学院, and Forward Alliance, and Doublethink Lab, and all of these civil society organizations, which are, voluntary and not part of the state. These people are organizing education around Chinese military voluntarily, and I think it shows again just how seriously Tony's civil society is taking the threat of, the Chinese military aggression.
Yes, I noticed from what you are both saying and from actually a lot of interviews I conducted, because I interviewed a lot of these civic society groups, and it's true that there's a lot of them. They are very active, they are extremely efficient, and because they are out of direct government control, it means whoever governs, they would still be active. So this is something that I want to ask you both. How can we help them further? How can we create a sort of ecosystem in which this kind of civic groups can uh, multiply and keep being efficient?
It's really difficult with this particular topic of Chinese interference because we have to acknowledge in this conversation that even though a lot of sectors of Taiwanese civil society take the threat of China very seriously and the threat of Chinese military aggression very seriously, there are also China itself is still a contentious issue in Taiwanese
Mm.
politics. And so we have to be very careful, when we're thinking about the way that the state is educating people about Chinese interference because, some people are very distrustful, for example, of the Democratic Progressive Party administration. So a lot of Taiwanese people, maybe they feel like I don't really trust a DPP, disinformation identification platform uh, because it's associated with the DPP, and I don't agree with the DPP's position. And we also and position on China, and so that's actually I think a pretty crucial part in answering your question is that how do we help the civic groups operate effectively is I think they need to be supported to maintain their separateness, their independence from the state and from the government because this this is about, trust, and this is about building people's trust and also the accessibility of information. And so we don't want to make the issue of Chinese interference a political issue. We want to avoid that as much as possible. So that's why it's really important to have at least the appearance of neutrality, of political neutrality, for a lot of these civil defense group um, that are working on countering Chinese interference. Whether that's something like COFACT, 真的假的, or one of the other GovZero projects. So that's one way we can help support the civic groups is making sure that they are as objective and treating the issue of Chinese interference as objectively as possible, as in a non-political way as possible, and making sure their methodology for, whether that's educating the public about foreign interference or misinformation and disinformation is as objective and verifiable through, external sources as much as possible.
Yeah, because being non-political is when you grab everybody, because if you become political, then you lose a portion of it. On the other hand, the younger generation in Taiwan who has taken on, as Maria mentioned in earlier question, that identity with the PRC, with China, with the mainland is less and less. Those who were born, within the last 50 years, they have a strong Taiwan identity, and they are the core audience of defending Taiwan, the political warfare influence, and they and younger people. So what is the good conduit to influence them? Social media. So I think much of Taiwan's effort to promote national defense, all-out defense, the全民国防, needs to take advantage of the social media, the social media that you see people use, including Facebook. I know MND has a Facebook account, and I think we have to start utilizing this type of conduit to conduct, lacking a better word, political warfare.
Tony Hu, Maria Thornton, thank you so much for being with us today.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Julianne. Thank you, Tony. It's nice to meet you.
Thank you, Mariah. Same here. Take care.
The war in Iran has had dramatic consequences beyond the country itself. The disruption of shipping in the Strait of Hormuz is having a profound impact worldwide. As usual, everyone has an opinion on what it means for Taiwan, but there is a lot of noise and not always much substance. It is easy to jump to conclusions about what China could do to Taiwan based on events in another part of the world and in a very different context. The real lessons are often hidden beneath the surface. We spoke with Philip Shetler-Jones. Philip had a different view and he shared his insights with us.
My name's Philip Shetler-Jones and I'm Senior Research Fellow for Indo-Pacific Security at the Royal United Services Institute, which is a defence think tank in London. The op-ed by Ike Freeman in the Financial Times entitled "Shutting Hormuz is a Template for China in Taiwan" argued Beijing will seek to replicate Tehran's playbook in the Taiwan Strait. Well, I wouldn't say I was trying to contradict it exactly, but I was looking at it from the other way around. That's right. You can see from cases like Ukraine and the Houthis how weaker parties have used low-cost systems to deny their better armed and more powerful adversaries control over key waterways in the Black Sea and the Red Sea. In the case of Taiwan, probably the last thing that the PRC would want is to cause widespread disruption to maritime trade, because the Chinese economy is itself so dependent on shipping for its own economic well-being. Also, it would probably try and deal with the Taiwan scenario in a way that would minimize the chance of internationalizing the issue.
And do you think that Taiwan has what it takes to do this, knowing the armament available to Taiwan? Do you think it could actually do that?
Well, you can draw lessons, but to apply the lessons, you need to be prepared. So in this case, that means Taiwan would need to get its industrial base up and running and stockpile all the necessary components and warheads they would need to use this kind of drone and missile systems over a long period. It may be some time before Taiwan could receive those supplies from overseas, compared with Ukraine, for example, where they had an open land border with supporting countries. The second thing is, as an island, closing the sea is one thing, but you need to keep the sea open for your own needs of freedom of navigation, especially providing fuel, food, pharmaceuticals. Taiwan has an advantage here, which is it is an island, but it's only around 60, 70 miles from the extent of its own waters to that of the neighbors, Philippines and Japan. So if they can close that gap, they would be able to keep those supply lanes open. But for that, you need to invest more in capabilities and engagement with partners. But according to an interview that the Minister for the Ocean Affairs Council gave to Nikkei last week, that is what they're doing. They're investing more in the Coast Guard and some of those capabilities. There are other areas like insurance, which was mentioned in the FT piece. That could be instructive for Taiwan when you look at what Ukraine did in 2023 with the British insurance company Marsh McLennan in partnership with Lloyd's and Ukrainian state banks, which was launching a facility called Unity, which provided affordable insurance for grain and later all kinds of non-military cargo, which stabilized their exports.
This is an interesting topic and one that is unexpected, actually, what you say about insurance. Would you be able to tell me more what you think Taiwan should do on this matter, or could do, or maybe even already does?
Well, as I say, I think it could probably learn some useful examples of what's possible by looking at what Ukraine did. The important thing is to get these facilities in place in advance of a crisis so that shipping doesn't stop. As we observed with the Hormuz crisis, shipping stopped out of a mixture of concern for insurance, but also welfare for crews. But once it's stopped, it can be quite hard to get moving again. So the trick would be to not just learn this lesson and then improvise once a crisis has started, but put the plan into place, ideally rehearse it, and by doing so, you might even deter the action that you're trying to avoid, because people will see it will not be effective.
If I can ask you also more detail on what you just said, you said when shipping stops, it's difficult to start it again. Can you tell me why is it so?
The business of risk has to deal with uncertainty. So when you're at the start of a crisis, the uncertainty is at the maximum. And so your safest course of action is usually just to stop until you have more information. And then when you have enough information, you can decide to start again or move. But I think that's why very often the initial response is to freeze. And then it's only later on that people feel they have enough confidence to know what will happen next to get things going again. So delay and uncertainty is really the most sort of dangerous feature of these kind of crises. So again, you can offset that to some extent by having plans in place, rehearsing them. Taiwan has an annual large-scale exercise where it tries to integrate broader forms of resilience. And so this would seem to be something that they might want to incorporate.
So if I understand what you're saying, that's very interesting, is that it's not only military, it seems that the danger is even like economical and logistical.
That's right, especially when it comes to the internationalization of the crisis. I mean, for an example, with Taiwan, that may be a little bit different from the experience you can see in the Gulf. A lot of the shipping companies bringing goods to and from Taiwan are also doing a lot of business with the PRC. So in a crisis, they may have a commercial conflict of interest, doing more business with China than Taiwan in some cases. So Taiwan may need to look at which companies it could rely on in such a situation, consider whether it's worth investing in carriers who would be more immune from those kind of commercial conflicts of interest. The other dimension is on the moral level, because when these disruptions go global, which I would expect to be the case with a Taiwan crisis, Tehran has managed quite effectively to cast the blame fully onto the US and Israel. And I'm sure Beijing would not wish to be seen as the one disrupting global shipping in a Taiwan crisis. So it's possible it would try to use a provocation that would allow it to shift the blame to Taipei or to the US, as it's trying to do preemptively with Japan now, to talk about Japan's remilitarization or sort of aggressive rhetoric. So yes, there are lots of dimensions in the financial, logistical, but also in the informational narrative space to consider.
Yes, that's also a very interesting point you're raising here. And in fact, tell me if you agree with that or if you observe that. But it would seem that China's attempt at controlling the narrative here would be not very efficient. I mean, in the case of Hormuz, most of the world is putting the opprobrium on the US and Israel. They seem to have an extremely hard time justifying themselves in the face of everybody. So more than likely, China would have an extremely hard time trying to convince anyone that when they are disrupting the entire world trade around Taiwan, it is the fault of Taiwan or of Japan or the US somehow, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think we can assume they would go about this kind of embargo or quarantine approach described in the FT op-ed in a way where they could hope to either achieve results very quickly, in which case the disruption would be too short-lived to be really harmful to China's reputation, or to create a narrative where it's not the embargo itself which is causing problems, but the reaction to the embargo on the part of the United States and its allies. And this is similar to the trick that Vladimir Putin, Russia pulled off with Ukraine, which was to say, it's not our invasion of Ukraine which is disturbing the flow of grain from Ukraine. It's the American support to the government in Kiev, which is prolonging the war, which is leading to sanctions and disruption of grain coming through the Black Sea. So again, there is a precedent for this kind of narrative jujitsu.
And again, do you think it's working? Do you think that China could actually convince anyone of that?
I think it would be difficult because the uncertainties about who would come into a crisis like this would tend to spread the uncertainty and multiply that risk assessment, not just in terms of how many countries will be involved, but how geographically widespread the danger area could be. And also the other dimension is time, how long the crisis goes on for, because that's the other multiplier of cost and disruption. So the American government currently has its traditional stance of strategic ambiguity on the question about whether it would come to Taiwan's defense. So that would probably cause a lot of people involved with shipping and other things at stake to err on the side of caution and assume that an escalation because of involvement of the US and allies like Japan would be more likely than not.
I see. And now, since we talk about Taiwan's preparedness for such a scenario, from what you observed, do you think Taiwan is already preparing enough or preparing at all for such a contingency?
Some preparations are becoming more visible. As I said, there's some quite interesting reporting about the investments being made by the Coast Guard. There was mention of more elaborate, I think, joint exercises and practices between the Coast Guard and the Navy to be more coordinated, perhaps with a coordinating task force that would bring them together effectively. There's also the reporting about restarting Taiwan's nuclear generation would go some way to alleviating their dependence on overseas supplies of fossil fuels for fuel. But in areas also mentioned in the FT piece, like stockpiles, I think Taiwan still has a long way to go. And that's an area where in a Taiwan Strait crisis, the PRC would have a strong advantage because they have invested in very, very large stockpiles of most of the commodities that they get from overseas. And so they would be able to hold out longer against a sort of counter blockade or any sort of situation where their sea trade was disrupted. So I think Taiwan probably could afford to do more on stockpiling.
Thank you. One last question then, since it seems like you are observing all of this very closely. What about the defense budget being discussed in Taiwan now, and as you know, is in a stalemate at the legislature? Is this affecting preparations for such a scenario to which an extent, or is this not entirely relevant?
I think it's only partly related because a lot of the things Taiwan could do to be more prepared for this kind of partial embargo or interference in its shipping are more about coordination mechanisms within the government, international outreach through commercial channels with shipping companies and so on. And these are not big ticket items, not like buying F-16 fighters or other large platforms. So I think a lot of it could be done irrespective of any problems that the government and the opposition have in agreeing on the defense budget.
Good. Is there anything else you would like to tell me on this topic?
No, I think we managed to basically go through all of the points that I had prepared, so I'm happy to leave it at that if you like.
All right, Philippe, thank you so much for your insights.
You're welcome.
We will meet again next week for a new episode of Taiwan versus the World.